The previous video in this series, Part 13, ended with at least some of the men of the disbanded 5th Kentucky Infantry returning home to hostile conditions and were often hiding or on the run from home guards and other Unionists. Some even resorted to violence and intimidation of their own in retaliation. This video follows the fate of specific individuals, beginning with the Barker brothers of Morgan County, descendants of George Barker Sr. through the line of his youngest son, John Barker Sr. After the death of the Barker patriarch at the Battle of Ivy Mountain, Henry, the oldest son, more or less assumed that mantle. He returned to their farm a mile south of Grassy Creek up what is now R. Stacy Road. He wasted no time in increasing the size of his family, as Angeline would give birth to their 5th child, William Benjamin, little more than 9 months after he mustered out. A 6th child, Rainey Green, would be born about the time the Civil War ended in 1865. He would live only to age 6. In addition to becoming an ordained minister and performing marriages and preaching at the Grassy Lick Regular Baptist Church a short distance from their farm, Henry would become a public school educator and teach many of the citizens of Morgan County over a span of 40 years. He suffered a massive stroke in March 1910. His obituary header read, quote, "A great educator gone," unquote. It was also noted that he was probably the best historian in the mountains of eastern Kentucky and a fine vocal musician. Henry was buried in the Grassy Lick Church Cemetery, and a Civil War veterans marker was added about 2006. Angeline applied for and received his pension in 1912 when the Civil War Pensions Act was passed. Henry's younger brother, John C. Barker, went home to his wife of 3 years, Catherine Lemaster. They soon moved to Kenwood, Kentucky, Johnson County. John was a widower when he submitted his Confederate pension application in 1912. One of the questions asked if the applicant took the oath of allegiance to the United States government. John answered, "Not at the time I was mustered out, and not until I was elected Justice of the Peace of Johnson County." John died in 1916 and is buried in the Johnson County Memorial Cemetery in Staffordsville, Kentucky. No photo of his original or his military marker is currently available. The third oldest brother, George W., was 22 years old and unmarried when the original 5th Kentucky disbanded. It is not clear why he was the only Barker or Gevedon to re-enlist. He resisted for more than 3 months before finally agreeing to a 3-year stint with the reorganized 5th Kentucky in February 1863. If it was more action and adventure he was looking for, he got more than he bargained for. The reorganized 5th was involved in the terrible slaughter at the Battle of Chickamauga. It also fought at the Second Battle of Chattanooga and was involved in numerous small battles and skirmishes during the Siege of Atlanta. George survived all of it and stayed with his unit until the end of the war. After a brief return to Kentucky, he moved to Missouri where he became a judge. He married a Missouri girl named America. George lived to be 92, dying in 1931, and is buried with his wife in Stockton, Missouri. While he wasn't the last living Confederate veteran, there couldn't have been many left by then. The youngest Barker brother, William Likens, was only 17 when he enlisted. There is no muster-out card for William, although many of the unit records have been lost. Or it is possible that he deserted. There is no pension application for William. In any case, he married Angeline's younger sister, Lou Ann Gevedon, and they lived in Crockett, Kentucky until his death in 1922. Henry M. Barker's brother-in-law, William Leach Gevedon, also returned to Grassy Creek and married Allie McClure in 1865, where he raised his family, practiced medicine, and preached the gospel. Dr. Gevedon was also known as the Mountain Evangelist. William lived to be 95 years old, dying in 1934. He outlived his wife by 38 years. William himself applied for his Confederate pension. He indicated that he had never taken the oath of allegiance to the United States government. His pension was granted. William's younger brother, Willis Green Gevedon, returned to Morgan County and married Mary Jane Carter in 1865 and lived out his life there. Willis also outlived his wife and was the applicant for his application in 1912. Like his brother William, he never took the oath of allegiance to the United States government, but his pension was granted. Willis died in 1923 and is buried near his brother at Grassy Creek. There were several other Barkers in the 5th Kentucky Infantry from other counties, including Elliott and Lawrence counties, who were descendants of George Barker Sr.'s middle son, Hezekiah. They included John Albert Barker and his brother Jesse. John Albert re-enlisted in the reorganized 5th and was taken prisoner in 1864 and sent to Camp Chase in Ohio. He was released 3 months later after taking the oath of allegiance to the United States. Jesse had also spent time at Camp Chase after being captured at Middle Creek in January 1862 and was released later that year in a prisoner exchange. Other descendants of Hezekiah in the 5th Kentucky Infantry included William, who died of disease in Gladeville, Virginia in the spring of 1862, Harvey, who switched sides after leaving the 5th and died of diarrhea in a Union hospital in 1864. Hardin and Lewis Barker were also 5th Kentucky members. Lewis had also been captured at Middle Creek, released in a prisoner exchange, had joined the reorganized 5th, captured again and sent back to Camp Chase, and died of pneumonia in 1865. All told, there were at least 10 descendants of George Barker Sr. who had been part of the 5th Kentucky Infantry at one time or another, and more in other units. Frustrated by his inability to secure a good assignment, General Humphrey Marshall resigned his commission in June 1863. He moved to Richmond, Virginia, where he practiced law and was elected to the Second Confederate Congress representing Kentucky. When the Confederacy began to collapse, he fled to Texas and after the war moved to New Orleans. His citizenship was restored by Andrew Johnson in 1867, and he moved to Louisville, Kentucky, where he continued to practice law. Marshall is buried in the State Cemetery in his native Frankfort. Edward Garrett, whose diary entries were a major contribution to our understanding of the movements of the 5th Kentucky Infantry, became increasingly delusioned, made evident by his melancholy entries. Waves of disease and despair swept through the demoralized, malnourished, under-equipped, and seemingly unappreciated ranks. Garrett himself threatened to resign his officer's commission on more than one occasion because of what he viewed as a lack of purpose and focus on the part of his own commanding general Humphrey Marshall and his superiors in Richmond. After Marshall finally made good on his resignation, Garrett took leave and traveled throughout the South, eventually ending up in the Army of Tennessee and involved in the unsuccessful defense of Atlanta. After the war, he returned to Kentucky, went to medical school, and eventually became a Presbyterian minister. Garrett died in 1916. Andrew Jackson May intensified his recruiting efforts in early 1863 and eventually was named colonel of the 10th Cavalry, but was often away from his post and was rarely present during most of its engagements in Kentucky and Tennessee. Perhaps he suffered a relapse of his unidentified illness or simply saw the handwriting on the wall after Lee's defeat at Gettysburg and gave up the cause. May returned to his farm and died in 1903 at the age of 74. After the 5th Kentucky Infantry disbanded, George Washington Noble returned to Breathitt County, where he spent a lot of time laying out in the hills to avoid Unionist bushwhackers. He gave a running account of the turmoil created by Unionist and rebel home guards, irregular militias, and individuals bent on revenge for past wrongs. Noble did himself no favors by becoming a Confederate recruiter, which was punishable by execution. He was eventually captured, but he convinced the Yankees that he was a regular member of the reorganized 5th Kentucky Infantry and became a prisoner of war and sent to Camp Chase in Columbus, Ohio, and later to Point Lookout, Maryland. After taking the oath of allegiance to the U.S. government in April 1863, he was released. He eventually made it back to Mount Sterling, Kentucky in June 1864. He was 20 years old. Noble eventually became an itinerant preacher and a bit of a religious fanatic with some pretty oddball ideas, and was mostly tolerated by the regular Baptists and Methodists. It is not known if Noble ever met any of the Morgan County Barkers, but on one occasion he had the chance to share the pulpit with Henry Barker's oldest son, John C. Johnny Barker. Reverend Barker was very well known in Wilkes County and was often a guest preacher at many of the churches while having his own church and school at Stillwater. Noble died at age 86 in 1930. Finally, there was Josie Underwood, who wrote so eloquently and passionately from Bowling Green, Kentucky. Like many young people of her time, she was swept along in the tumult, engulfing not only her local circumstances, but that of the entire country. A proper Southern belle from a prominent family that simultaneously owned slaves while being staunchly Unionist, who fell in love with a young lawyer that joined the Confederate cause, Josie could not reconcile her love for him and loyalty to her family. Josie's Mount Air burnt to the ground, love lost and family fractured. Fortune swept her away from it all when Abraham Lincoln appointed her father as ambassador to Scotland. 20-year-old Josie spent the remainder of the war in a different world, the war a distant if vivid memory. Here's where Josie Underwood's story gets very interesting indeed. Historians knew nothing of Josie and her unique and historically important diary for more than a century, until a manually typed Xerox copy of the diary arrived at Christ Episcopal Church in Bowling Green, Kentucky in 1976. It had been sent from the Dead Letter Division of the Atlanta Post Office because there was a copy of Josie Underwood Nasro's marriage certificate with the diary. She had married Charles A. Nasro in the church on October 26, 1870. The diary was turned over to Western Kentucky University. To this day, no one knows where the original is, who transcribed it, where it was sent from, and how it ended up in the Atlanta Dead Letter Division. What we do know is that Josie Underwood Nasro died in Warren County, Kentucky in July 1924. Unfortunately, there is no known photograph of her. Her will names her granddaughter, Joanna, as recipient of the diary. Joanna bequeathed her estate to her husband, Joseph Mullen, when she died in 1963. Mullen, in turn, left his estate to Rice University and the Sloan Kettering Institute for Cancer Research. Neither institution had the diary. While the mysteries remain, Josie's account has become an important window into the Civil War period in Kentucky. It has been featured by the National Geographic Society, and after some wrangling over ownership and copyright of the manuscript, the diary was published in 2009. It can be studied at the University of Kentucky Scholarship online website. And that brings to a close the 14-part video series on the descendants of George Barker Sr. of Wilkes County, North Carolina, and whose many descendants fought in the Civil War, like two of his sons who fought in the American Revolution a century before. The entire video series is available on YouTube.